Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a book review of the book The Golden Queen by Dave Wolverton. Most people probably know him for either his Star Wars novel that he wrote, The Courtship of Princess Leia, or they know him under the pseudonym that he wrote the Rune Lords series and a few other projects. I am a big fan of the Rune Lords. It is one of my top favorite fantasy series, and it is just also one of my top favorite series of all time. And I think it has the best world building and magic system of any fantasy novel series I've ever read, and it just has this style that I really like and can get behind. Conversely, I'm not the biggest fan of Courtship of Princess Leia. Didn't really care for the book, which is fine. You know, every author can have books I don't like. So even though I'm a huge David Wolverton fan, I have some books of his that are top tier books, and then one book I read that I didn't particularly like. Sadly, we lost Mr. Wolverton last year, last January. It was a very sad time, and interestingly, the day that I started reading this was the 1 year anniversary of Mr. Wolverton's death. So it was a very sad day and I didn't even mean to, I picked up this book to read it, and then I noticed on my Facebook the notifications of my memories. So it's very sad that we've lost Mr. Wolverton, but it's always great to get to find new books by your favorite authors, even if that author isn't releasing new novels. And so I picked these books up at bookstores a year ago and have been meaning to get into them. This is the first in a trilogy. This is called The Golden Queen. The second book is Beyond the Gate. The third is Lords of the Seventh Swarm. And I wanted to read these just because they were David Farland. That was the only thing keeping me wanting to read them. But there's no online discussion about these books. There's none. There's no YouTube videos. There's I couldn't really find Reddit threads. There's just no discussion about these books. And yet he was able to publish a full trilogy in hardcover through Tor. And so I was really interested to see why it wasn't really discussed much, and I can totally understand it. But this book does have a kind of interesting tone. First of all, has a very 70s, 80s type cover, even though it came out in the 90s. You've got the moon there that looks similar to the Death Star. You've got your three heroes. You have Galen there. Then you have Maggie there, and then you have Oric the bear, who is such a fun animal sidekick, but a talking animal sidekick. And then on the back cover you have Verace and Everin. Which some people I saw on the Goodreads reviews, which there were a few of them for this book. Some people said they had a hard time reading Everin because they read everyone. But to me, I never had that issue. It always was Everin for me. So this is an old school type cover, and this gave a vibe of not cheap but cheesy fantasy sci-fi from the 70s and 80s. The one property I would concretely say this reminds me of is the Willow. Willow is more fantasy, whereas this is a science fiction. But Willow just has that indelible quality that it just looks kind of cheesy, but it's taking itself seriously, and it's genre entertainment. But at the same time, you're that looks a little bit like a satire of the genre. That's how I kind of feel with this. It's taking itself seriously, and it is a good sci-fi story, but then there's some elements of the production of this book that make me just go, interesting choice there. That's a little cheesy choice. So that's what I would compare this to. The first two chapters, reading those, you would think you were reading an epic fantasy, because it starts, with characters in a forest going to an inn, and there are creatures attacking them, and they're on the run, and you have this kind of character who's kind of flirting with the girl at the inn, and he's talking with several religious leaders. It just has that kind of fantasy feel to it. But as the book progresses, you learn this is not a fantasy world. This is a science fiction universe. And as you can see, based off the the cover, there are gates to other worlds. And in this book, the basic premise is that there is these insectoid creatures, the Dronin, are taking over the universe. And there was a government that was fighting against them, but the leader of that government, Semirite, has been killed. And her daughter/clone, Everin, of course, none of this is spoilers because this is all in the book flap of the jacket. Her daughter, in the summary, her daughter Everin is on the run with her protector, Varese, and they are trying to escape their captors while at the same time achieve the goal of stopping the Dronin from taking over the universe. And our three main protagonists of this book, Galen, Maggie, and Auric, but Galen is like the primary protagonist. Maggie is one of the love interests, and then also you have Auric, who is the bear, who's like the sidekick. He's kind of, in some ways, he's kind of like Chewbacca, except if Chewbacca talked. Like, actually, just like talked normal. But he has a lot of like Chewbacca-like qualities. Like, he's really strong, but he's also really philosophical. Anyway, they run across Everin and decide to end up helping her on her quest. And so this book starts at the beginning, you're on one planet, and then midway through the book, you move to another, where you're on that second planet for a good portion. And then the last third of the book, it's just planet hopping. They're hop to new planets. So as you go along, you start, not only does Wolverton introduce new science fiction elements, but also he introduces them faster and faster, and they get more crazy sci-fi. Like, at the beginning, it's basically Earth that you're on, and then in the second planet you're on, it's like, it's not exactly Earth, it's different, but you can kind of get behind it, and then, like, as you just go along, by the end of the book, you're like, okay, there's no way this is like a real planet, like, this is just bizarre. So it just keeps jumping further and further into the bizarre. This is the first book of a trilogy, but at the same time, it is also a standalone. It does complete its story. I'm going to keep making this comparison because it's the most obvious, but it's kind of like Star Wars. Star Wars, you have, A New Hope kind of standalone. They defeat the Death Star. They end that plot arc, and they get the medal ceremony. But it leaves open future stories and really does set up the trilogy. That's how this is. It's also like Mistborn from Brandon Sanderson, if you're a fan of that, and you don't want my Star Wars comparisons. But Mistborn, the first book, is a standalone, and then you can read more. So this is one of those, you could read this and then determine if you don't really like it, you don't have to keep going with the series because you get a pretty much complete story. But if you do really like it, you can keep going. And I really liked it. By the way, this was the first book that I read where I had I put my cover on it, the Demco covers that I got for Christmas, and it crinkles, which is nice. But it worked out really well. The book cover still looks pretty good because the inside, I won't show you this, but the inside of the book cover was actually fading because the book was old and was not cared for well. So anyway, so getting back into the book itself, it has all these tropes that are very common in fantasy sci-fi stories. You have the reluctant hero, you have the moral quandaries, you have the love triangle, you have the damsel in distress, you also have the girl who can take care of herself, but also she kind of needs help. You have the sidekick who is really helpful and really thoughtful. You have the other sidekick who doesn't really trust you. You have all the tropes that just make a great fantasy sci-fi story, and they're all in here, and they're all present. So I think that you will for sure at least be entertained. And I recently read The Stone of Farewell, the fantasy novel by Tad Williams, and it was like one of those books that it was so well constructed, and I could see the brilliance of the book, but it was so boring to me. This is like the reverse, where this is such an entertaining book, so entertaining, but a lot of people would say it's derivative and not particularly well crafted, even though it's highly entertaining. Like, this is one of the most entertaining books I've read this year. It was just a blast to read, and the going from sequence to sequence to sequence was just so much fun. But I could see if people had legitimate criticisms of it, I can understand why. I don't think it's a perfect book by any stretch of the mind, and it's not necessarily like a best book of the year, but it's, when it comes to entertainment value, it's one of my favorites this year. If not, it's the most entertaining book I've read. So I did really have a blast reading this book. There is some interesting discussion in this book about religion, particularly in the first couple of chapters, about religious leaders and religious duties, and how does those religious duties affect your moral beliefs? And there's some debates between characters on biblical worldviews, and if that's not your thing, it ends after the first 3-4 chapters. So it does end pretty quickly, but it is present in the book in a few scenes. And to me, it was fascinating because not only are you seeing just an interesting dialogue in the book, but when you add in the fact that Dave Wolverton was a Mormon from the Church of Latter-day Saints, you even understand maybe a little bit of the discussions better and find more intricacies to it. So when it comes to the love triangle, there's the love triangle between Maggie, between Galen, and between Everin, and it's one of those things. I understand what Dave Wolverton was going for, and he explains why he goes in this direction well, but I just don't like that type of storyline. I prefer the male character to have one female love interest and only that one. I wonder if this was kind of part of his, because this was coming out around the same time as The Wheel of Time, and you have Randall Thor with all of his weird love interests in that series. So I'm wondering if that influenced him a little bit, but it's just not my preferred style. When it comes to romance stories, I prefer not to have a love triangle, but it still was done well, and I was overall happy with how the love triangle ended up. But I need to read book 2 to feel more confident about it, to see where he takes book 2. But book 1 was highly entertaining. And that's, of course, the phrase I will repeat over and over. It was a highly entertaining book. I thoroughly enjoyed myself while reading this book, and it got me out of the reading slump where I had been reading consistently with Stone of Farewell, but it felt like a chore. This book was not a chore. This book was like a delight. It was whereas reading Stone of Farewell felt like it was like eating spinach, which was so bland, but yet good for you. This book felt like eating ice cream. I was like, yes, this is so much fun. I love this. Let's do this again. So, but I don't think I could do a steady diet of this type of book, which is why I'm not reading the books back to back to back. I'm going to put about a month in between these books. So I enjoyed reading The Golden Queen. I think it's a fascinating story. Becomes much more science fiction-y as you go along in it, but also has a lot of the tropes of fantasy, and you can see some of the stylistic things that he would eventually use in The Rune Lords, which for me is a much better series, but that's also because it's fantasy, and this is sci-fi, and I prefer fantasy. So if you've read The Golden Queen, let me know your thoughts down below. Are you frustrated that there's no one talking about it online like I am, or do you think we shouldn't bother talking about it? Leave those thoughts in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.